I'm not pure anymore, the pregnant widow screamed at the Sioux man after being abused by the man she once called father. Imagine being cast out of your home while expecting, in your womb lies the undeniable proof of a crime you didn't commit, yet one you were forced to endure. Picture yourself trudging across a desolate, sun-scorched wilderness, every stranger you pass silently condemning you without knowing your truth. And now envision in that barren, forgotten expanse someone who sees beyond your wounds, someone as ostracized as you, yet still capable of loving without judgment. This is the story of Aurelia and Yande, two wounded souls who found each other when hope was all but gone, and discovered sometimes it's in the harshest deserts that the truest oases arise. If you believe every soul deserves a second chance at love, hit subscribe to see more stories of redemption and hope like this. The desert lay like an open wound on earth. The relentless midday sun beat down on fractured stones, turning each grain of sand into tiny embers scorching through bare souls. In that remains-of-world wasteland stretching endless beyond the horizon, Aurelia wandered, torn between life and death. Her lips, once soft as wild rose petals, were now cracked and bleeding salty tears. Her mourning dress, black, once a fortress of dignity in her hometown of St. Aria, hung in tattered shreds from her frail frame. Yet the weight she bore most heavily was her swollen belly, not just with the child, but with the shame each growing curve represented in the world's eyes. She'd been walking 3 days. 3 days since the doors of her family home slammed shut behind her, sealed by shouts of disgrace and sinner that echoed down the stone streets. 3 days surviving on the scant dew clinging to cactus pads, chewing bitter roots among the rocks. Aurelia faltered, her legs brittle like dry twigs ready to snap. Her trembling hand caressed the gentle stirrings in her womb, the only shard of purity left in her shattered world. Tears dried before reaching her sunburned cheeks. "Forgive me," she whispered to the life within. "Forgive me for not giving you a better world." Then her strength abandoned her entirely. She collapsed into the scalding sand, her knees then her arms giving way until she surrendered to the cruel earth. Above her, the steel-blue sky seemed to spin, and Aurelia thought maybe it would be kinder if she and her baby simply vanished in this God-forsaken place where no one could ever judge them again. The wind shifted, carrying the earthy smell of dried soil and something else, something her dulled senses didn't immediately place. Footsteps, slow, cautious, drifting across the sand like a spectre. Aurelia forced her eyelids open. Through haze of fatigue and fever, she made out a figure framed by the blinding sun. A tall, solid presence, moving with the silent grace of a being born of the desert itself. Approaching, she saw a man, bronzed skin aged by eternal sunshine, long black hair like nightfall, muscles sculpted by survival. A Sioux man. Aurelia's heart pounded, not with fear but with something more tangled, a knot of relief and despair. Here was someone as rejected by civilization as she was, someone the world had banished to its fringes, to places where white men's laws held no sway. He stopped a few paces away, his dark eyes heavy with ancient sorrow. No judgment lay in them, only a silent understanding she had never found back in St. Aria. His name was Yande. He had lost everything years ago, his village decimated by settler greed, his wife slain by disease carried by white men, his people scattered as seeds on infertile wind. He was the last of his line, the bearer of traditions and memories carried off into the breeze of time. He lived among canyons and cliffs, hunting with bow and arrow, foraging wild fruits, drinking from scarce natural springs. He'd learned to see life where others saw only death, to call the desert his home when the rest of the world turned inhospitable. And now before him stood a woman, as cast out as he. Yande knelt on the sand, still far enough to be respectful. From his leather pouch he produced a small gourd water canteen and offered it with a gentle, deliberate gesture of peace. "Water," he said, in the broken English he'd gleaned living between two worlds. Aurelia stared at it, like it was an illusion. Her throat was fire, her mouth felt like old leather, but as she reached out, something inside shattered. All the voices from town screeched through her mind. Sinner, lost woman, dirty, impure. "I'm not pure anymore," she screamed with every bit of strength left, knocking the canteen aside. "Don't touch me, don't help me, I am... Her words dissolved into sobs that shook her fragile body. Yande did not recoil. He remained unmoving as a mountain, letting her pour out her grief into the hot desert air. He offered no hollow consolations, no rushed comforts. He simply stayed, solid presence amid her soul's turmoil. When her sobs finally eased, he placed the canteen on the sand within reach and slid back a few steps. Without a word, he began building a rudimentary shelter with dry branches and his own leather cloak, creating a shade, a blessed shadow over her sun-scorched form. The action was simple, yet deeper than she expected in all the world. Here was someone who asked no questions, who demanded nothing except to create a sanctuary. A flicker she'd long forgotten stirred in her heart. For the first time in months, she felt something long lost, hope. Night draped the desert like velvet embroidered with stars. The suffocating heat of day gave way to a cool breeze scented with night-blooming flowers among cacti. Aurelia woke beneath the makeshift shelter, the canteen of water within arm's reach untouched. Yande sat a few yards away, feeding a small fire with dry twigs. The flames flickered in his dark eyes, casting shadows that deepened the lines etched into his face by time and sorrow. He didn't look directly at her, respecting the boundary she had set, but his presence was a silent balm in the loneliness devouring her. "Why?" Aurelia asked, her voice hoarse, breaking the silence of the night. "Why are you helping me?" Yande lifted his gaze, and in his eyes she saw a sadness as deep as hidden wells in the desert, places where water lurks far beneath the sunburned surface. "Because I know what it means to be thrown away," he said, his words shaped by the rhythm of his native tongue and the English he had learned through pain. "My people called it ikatu, when someone is cast out of the tribe like a cracked pot." She took a small sip of water, and it slid down her throat like the first rain after a season of drought. The liquid brought not just physical relief, but the stirrings of dulled senses. For the first time in weeks she could taste something besides bitterness. "I wasn't cast out," she whispered, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. I ran." After they found out, Yande stirred the fire with a branch, sparks rising to the star-filled sky like glowing prayers. "Sometimes running is the only way to survive," he said. "My village didn't fall all at once. It died slowly. First they took our land, then our rivers. Then came the sicknesses our healers couldn't fight. When I realized there was nothing left to defend, I ran too." Silence stretched between them, not the awkward kind, but the kind born of shared understanding, the kind that required no explanations. Aurelia watched as Yande prepared a herbal infusion from the plants he'd gathered that day. Each motion was careful, deliberate, almost sacred, like a dance passed down through generations. "How did you know I was out there?" she asked. "The desert speaks to those who listen," Yande replied, handing her a small cup of steaming tea. "Your footsteps changed the rhythm of the sand. Your tears left a trail only the desperate know how to leave." Aurelia accepted the cup, her hands trembling slightly as they brushed his. The touch wasn't charged, but it stirred something forgotten inside her, the feeling of not being entirely alone in the world. The tea tasted like soil and hope, with a bitter note that reminded her of roots surviving buried deep during the longest droughts. As she drank, warmth spread through her chest, loosening knots that had lived there for months, born from secrets and shame. "In the town I came from," she began, her voice gradually gaining strength, "they say Sioux are savages, that you don't have souls. That you're less than animals." Yande smiled for the first time since she'd woken, a sad smile but not bitter. "And what do you believe now?" he asked. She looked at the shelter that protected her, at the fire warming her, at the tea soothing her pain, at the man who didn't know her, owed her nothing, but still chose kindness in a world that had only offered rejection. "I think the real savages are the ones building churches back in town," she said, surprised by her own courage. They spent the rest of the night in fragments of conversation. He told her the legends of his people, of how stars were the spirits of warriors guiding lost travelers. She spoke of her life before the nightmare, how she used to sew dresses for the townswomen and dreamed of owning a small shop. They didn't speak of the trauma that had brought them there, not yet, but in the space between words, they built a fragile, precious bridge, the first real connection either had felt in a long time. When the first light of dawn painted the horizon in rose and gold, Aurelia fell asleep, for the first time in weeks, without nightmares. And Yande, watching over her, allowed himself to believe the desert hadn't just sent him another broken soul to care for, but someone who might share the burden of survival. If you believe every soul deserves a second chance at love, don't forget to subscribe for more stories of redemption and hope like this. The following days settled into a rhythm as gentle as the desert's breath at dawn. Yande built Aurelia a sturdier shelter between two large stones, weaving dry branches and palm leaves in a pattern she had never seen but felt as natural as the growth of the plants themselves. She watched him work, in awe of his economy of movement, the way his large, calloused hands could coax beauty from the simplest materials. There was an infinite patience in his every gesture, patience born from years living by nature's time, far from the artificial rush of city men. "Did you learn that from your father?" Aurelia asked, sitting in the shade while he adjusted the last layer of cover. "From my grandfather," Yande replied without stopping. "He used to say a house shouldn't just protect you from rain and sun. It should be a place where your soul can rest." Aurelia instinctively touched her belly, where the child now stirred more actively each day. "And what if your soul doesn't remember how to rest?" Yande paused and looked at her with that quiet intensity she was starting to recognize. It was as if he could see through words, all the way to the wounded center of her fears. "Then it needs time to relearn," he said, like a plant pulled from the ground. "First, it must accept the new soil before it can grow again." The metaphor struck something deep inside her. All her life, Aurelia had been the obedient daughter, the devoted wife, the respectable widow, always defined by how she fit into molds others had made for her. Now torn from everything she'd ever known, she felt like one of the plants Yande spoke of, lost, uprooted, unsure if she could bloom again. But as the days slipped by, subtle changes began to take root. Her hands, once soft and delicate, grew calloused from helping him gather firewood and herbs. Her sun-scorched skin took on a golden hue she'd never seen in her own reflection. Her muscles, weakened by pregnancy and malnutrition, slowly regained strength through daily walks to the nearest spring. And if you too are rebuilding your life, remember, every small step is a victory. Keep following our journey here, and subscribe to see more stories showing how transformation often grows out of the hardest seasons. One morning, while Yande was checking the traps he'd set for small game, Aurelia decided to try something she hadn't done since leaving St. Aria: sewing. She found a few usable scraps from her torn dress, and using cactus spines as needles and plant fibers as thread, she began patching the most worn areas. Her fingers remembered. The delicate dance between needle and cloth had once been second nature, but now, stitching while seated in desert sand, with the wind drying her sweat and the sun warming her shoulders, the act held new meaning. She wasn't sewing to impress the town's ladies or to earn a few coins. She was sewing for herself, to cover her body, to restore her dignity in a world that had tried to strip her of both. When Yande returned, he found her focused, tongue slightly between her lips in a childlike expression of concentration that made him smile. "You've got skilled hands," he said, inspecting the tiny, even stitches she'd made. "My mother taught me," Aurelia replied, then paused. Before she decided I wasn't her daughter anymore." Yande sat beside her, still at a respectful distance, offering his presence without pressure. "Tell me about her." Aurelia hesitated. Talking about her family meant reopening wounds that hadn't yet healed, but something about Yande made speaking easier. Maybe because he carried his own losses, maybe because his gaze held no judgment. "She was the most beautiful woman in St. Aria," Aurelia began, fingers still threading stitches. "Hair like ripe wheat, skin pale like porcelain. Everyone said I took after my father. Dark-haired, plain, none of her grace. And did that bother you?" "For a long time, yes. I wanted to be like her, to be admired, to feel enough." Aurelia paused as the cactus needle slipped slightly from her grip. "But she was never really my mother, not in the way that mattered. She was more like a doll in the house, beautiful, but distant. It was Benedita who raised me, our housemaid. She taught me how to sew, cared for me when I was sick, comforted me when the other girls mocked the way I looked. Where is Benedita now?" Her hands froze. She swallowed hard, fighting back the surge rising in her throat. "She died last year, fever took her, and after she was gone, that's when my father—" She couldn't finish, but didn't have to. Yande understood. "He waited until there was no one left to protect you," he said, voice steady, laced with tightly held fury. Aurelia nodded, tears finally falling. "Benedita was the only one who ever truly loved me in that house. After she died, I had no one. When my father started to... She drew a breath, pushing herself to continue. "I tried to tell my mother, but she said I was lying, that I was trying to ruin the reputation of a respected man. She told me I'd always been difficult, always looking for the wrong kind of attention." Yande reached out slowly, giving her time. When she didn't pull away, he gently touched her shoulder, a chaste, brotherly gesture. without the weight of ulterior motives. "Your mother was wrong," he said, his voice solid as stone. "What he did wasn't your fault, and the child you carry, it isn't punishment. It's a new life, clean, untouched by the sins of others." For the first time since learning of the pregnancy, Aurelia allowed herself to see the baby not as a burden or a brand of shame, but as Yande described it, a beginning, a life untainted, a possible future. That night, beneath a sky of starlight scattered like tiny beacons of hope, something shifted in her chest. It still hurt, maybe it always would, but for the first time in months, pain wasn't the only thing she felt. Aurelia's transformation didn't come in a single sweeping miracle, but in delicate layers, like peeling the skin from an onion. Each morning brought a revelation, a nearly imperceptible lessening of the weight she carried on her slumped shoulders. Yande had shaped a rhythm for them that matched the desert's natural pace. They rose with the first blush of dawn, when the air was cool and the light soft like yellow silk. He would go to check traps or gather fruit, while she organized their small camp and prepared the healing herbs he'd taught her to recognize. "This one," he said, holding a small silver-leafed plant, "helps settle your stomach when the baby gets restless. And this one," he said, showing her a blossom with delicate purple petals, "will help you sleep without nightmares." Aurelia drank in these lessons like a dry sponge takes in water. Her whole life she'd relied on others to tend her health, first Benedita, then the town doctor, then the midwives. But now for the first time she was learning how to care for herself and the life inside her, drawing from the ancient knowledge Yande carried like sacred memory. One afternoon, as they walked in search of a new fishing spot along the winding streams hidden between the rocks, Aurelia realized something surprising. She no longer felt ashamed of how she looked. The sun had bronzed her once olive skin into a sheen of polished copper. Her hair, once tightly pinned into elaborate buns to mask its plain color, now fell freely down her back in dark waves that danced with the breeze. "You look different," Yande observed, resting in the shade beneath a rock formation rising like a cathedral sculpted by wind. "Different how?" she asked, genuinely curious. There were no mirrors in the desert, only the occasional shimmer of water that reflected distorted fragments of her face. "Stronger," he said, "like you found something you thought was lost." Aurelia reflected on his words as she dipped her feet into the cool stream. He was right. She had found something. She couldn't quite name it, but it felt like a small flame lit inside her chest, burning low but steady, warming her from within in a way she hadn't felt since childhood. "You know what I miss," she said suddenly. "What's that?" "Choice. Back in town, every move I made was watched, judged, controlled. I couldn't leave the house without a hat. It wasn't ladylike. I couldn't speak to men unless chaperoned. It gave the wrong impression. I couldn't laugh out loud because decent women don't make noise." She laughed then, and the sound echoed across the stones like music. "But out here, I can laugh when I want, walk barefoot, even talk to you without anyone whispering behind my back." Yande watched her with a new intensity, as if truly seeing her for the first time. The broken, desperate woman he had found in the desert was giving way to someone stronger, more alive. It wasn't just physical, though the sun and open-air life had transformed her appearance. It was deeper, a shift in how she carried herself through the world. "And what will you do with that freedom?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. For so long, her life had been a string of obligations and expectations. She'd never truly considered what she wanted for herself. "I want my child to grow up knowing they can choose too," she said, hand moving instinctively to her belly. "I want to teach them that they don't have to fit into someone else's mold, that they can be wild if they want, free. And you? What do you want for yourself?" Aurelia looked at Yande, really looked, maybe for the first time. She saw the fine lines around his eyes, etched by years under an unforgiving sun. She saw the strength in his broad shoulders, the gentleness in his large hands. She saw the sorrow he carried, but also the peace he had forged in his solitude. "I want to learn," she said, "everything you can teach me, about plants, survival, about how to be free without needing anyone's permission." That night, Yande began teaching her about the stars. He pointed out constellations his people had used to navigate, shared legends of warriors and princesses turned to light, explained how to read the sky for signs of coming weather. "My grandfather used to say that everyone is born under a specific star," he told her, motioning to a bright one above, "and that our task in life is to find it and follow where it leads." "Did you find yours?" she asked. Yande was silent for a long time, eyes fixed on the heavens. "I thought I had," he said finally. When I had a family, a village to protect, but once all that was gone, I wandered, lost, without direction, without purpose. And now? He lowered his gaze to her, and there was something different in his expression, tender and frightening at the same time. Now I think maybe my star was leading me to you. The air between them changed. It wasn't desire, not yet, but something deeper, a recognition of a bond forming, more dangerous and more sacred than mere kindness between strangers. It was the beginning of something else. Aurelia's heart quickened, not with fear but with a kind of hope she didn't know how to name. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she let herself imagine a future that was more than just surviving. The weeks unfolded like yarn through the fingers of a skilled weaver. Aurelia felt herself growing, not just in size as the baby developed, but in confidence, in strength, in a deeper understanding of who she was beneath all the layers of shame she had carried. Yande had become more than her protector. He was her teacher, her silent companion in the cool mornings, her anchor when the desert's loneliness pressed down like a heavy blanket. But there was something else between them now, a delicious tension neither dared name. She watched him when he wasn't looking, how his muscles tightened as he drew back the bow to hunt, how his long fingers carved wooden tools with precision, how his brow furrowed as he studied plants for signs of coming rain. And he watched her, though he tried to be discreet. He noticed how she'd learned to move across the rocky terrain with feline grace, how her hands had grown skilled with the herbs, how her laughter, once timid and stifled, now rang freely off the canyon walls. One afternoon, as they sorted through the week's gathered provisions, Aurelia asked a question that had lingered in her mind for days. "Do you miss your wife?" Yande froze mid-motion, his hands still over a pile of roots. Aurelia immediately regretted the question, fearing she'd touched a wound too deep. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I shouldn't have asked." "No," he said softly, lifting his eyes to meet hers. "You can ask. It's fair." He sat back on his heels, hands resting on his knees, gathering the courage to open a door long kept shut. "Her name was Kuna," he began, voice laced with a painful tenderness. "It means woman in my language, but to me, it meant everything. We were promised to each other as children, grew up together like two trees whose roots entwine as they reach for the sky." Aurelia felt a sting she didn't immediately understand. Jealousy, sorrow, awe at a love so deep. "She died during the smallpox epidemic that ravaged our village," Yande continued. "I held her in my arms while the fever consumed her. I whispered every prayer I knew. I offered my own life to the spirits in her place. But the gods of white men were stronger than ours that day." Silence settled between them, heavy with shared grief. Aurelia knew that pain, of losing someone who was a part of your very being. "For a long time," Yande said, "I thought my heart had died with her, that I'd never feel anything for anyone again." He looked at her then, and in his eyes was something new, vulnerability, fear, and a spark that made Aurelia's heartbeat stumble. "But you—" He hesitated as if the words were sacred, too fragile to be spoken carelessly. "You reminded me that a heart can heal, that it can love again, maybe differently, but just as truly." Aurelia felt tears sting her eyes, not of sadness, but of a complex feeling she couldn't name. Gratitude, relief, and something deeper, something she wasn't ready to call what it might be. "I thought I'd never trust a man again," she admitted. "After what my father did, after how my mother abandoned me, I thought something in me was broken, like I was made to attract cruelty." "There's nothing broken in you," Yande said, shifting slightly closer. "What happened to you is about his darkness, not your light." His words touched a wounded place in her that had begun to heal. For the first time, she didn't see herself as a victim, but as a survivor, not someone stained by another's sin, but someone still standing, despite everything. "Yande," she whispered, I want to touch you, not for that, just to know you're real, that this is real." He extended his hand slowly, giving her space to pull away if she chose. When their palms met, a jolt ran through her, not of desire, but recognition, as if their souls had reunited after wandering apart for lifetimes. They stayed like that for long minutes, hands joined, breath synchronized, eyes closed, absorbing the strange, sacred feeling of not being alone anymore. When they pulled apart, the air between them had changed. They hadn't exchanged words of love. It was too soon, too delicate for that. But something had been acknowledged, a seed planted, a promise made in silence. That night, They slept closer than before, though still with a respectful space between them. But for the first time since they met, Aurelia fell asleep not just surviving but living, and more than that, believing she might someday be happy. The baby stirred inside her, as if sensing the shift in the air, and she smiled into the dark, one hand on her belly, and the other stretched toward the space where Yande slept, an invisible bridge connecting three hearts learning to beat in unison. Dawn crashed into their world like thunder on a cloudless day. Aurelia woke with her heart pounding, not from the rising sun tinting the sky rose gold, but from the unmistakable sound of horses' hooves echoing off the canyon walls. Many hooves, fast approaching. Yande was already on his feet, body tense like a drawn bow, eyes fixed toward the sound. His hand gripped the hilt of the knife he always carried, and in that moment, Aurelia saw a transformation that chilled her. The gentle man she'd come to know gave way to the warrior who had survived the fall of his people. "Hide behind the large rocks," he whispered, urgency slicing through his voice. "Don't come out no matter what you hear." "But what about you?" she asked, ice crawling through her blood. "I'll see what they want. Maybe they'll pass." But they both knew that wasn't true. Riders didn't come into the desert by accident. They were looking for something, or someone. Aurelia did as he said, heart pounding so loud she feared they might hear it across the sand. Through a narrow gap in the rock, she saw them emerge from the morning mist like vengeful ghosts. At the front rode a man she recognized instantly, though she had hoped never to see him again. Reverend Anselm Harrow, her father. He looked older, gaunter, grayer, but his eyes held the same cruel coldness she knew too well. Beside him rode Judge Ignatius Braddock, a zealous moralist known for hunting down sinners with fanatical rigor. "Where is she?" Anselm shouted, his voice booming across the canyon. "We know she's here, savage!" Yande stood motionless, not even blinking. "I don't know who you're talking about." "My daughter!" Anselm spat, the words like venom. "The disgrace who ran away carrying the fruit of her corruption. The townspeople saw her walking this way. Many people cross the desert," Yande said calmly. "Most don't survive." Braddock spurred his horse forward, the animal dancing beneath him. "You don't understand, heathen. This woman has sinned against God and nature. She must be returned to face judgment." Aurelia felt bile rise in her throat. Judgment, as if she were guilty of the crime committed against her. "And what crime would that be?" Yande asked. His voice was different now, quiet, sharp, a calm before the storm. "Fornication, deceit, attempting to defame a holy man," Anselm snarled. "She spun vile stories about me when her pregnancy was discovered, tried to blame others for her own depravity." The fury that erupted in Aurelia's chest nearly propelled her out of hiding. It took everything in her to stay silent. Then she saw Yande step forward, and the danger in his posture froze her to the stone. "I see," he said, voice low and slow as a mountain cat's growl. "So you rode into the desert to capture a pregnant woman running from—" "Lies," she told. "Exactly," Braddock snapped. "Even a savage can understand justice when it's explained plainly." Yande smiled then, and it was the most terrifying smile Aurelia had ever seen. "Yes," he said. "I understand perfectly." What happened next unfolded in a heartbeat. Yande moved like water, drawing his blade and rolling sideways just as Braddock charged. In one fluid motion, he slashed the horse's legs, sending it crashing to the ground and throwing the judge like a sack of rocks. The soldiers moved, but Yande knew the terrain like breath. He vanished and reappeared between stone and shadow, a ghost made flesh. Within minutes, 3 men lay dead or dying on the sand. But there were too many. Eventually they cornered him. Anselm, who had stayed well behind during the chaos, rode forward with a victorious sneer. "Now, savage," he said, "you'll tell us where my daughter is, or die slowly." That's when Aurelia could no longer stay hidden. Seeing Yande surrounded, wounded, and bleeding because of her was more than she could bear. She stepped out from behind the rocks like a spirit risen from the desert, her unbound hair whipping in the wind, her patched dress fluttering around her pregnant form. "I'm right here," she said, her voice carrying a command she didn't know she possessed. "Let him go." Reverend Harrow's face lit up with relief so false it made her sick. "Aurelia, my dear child, thank God we've found you." The hypocrisy in his voice ignited a cold fury inside her. "I'm not your child," she said, each word slicing the air like shattered glass. "A father doesn't do what you did." "Silence," he roared, the mask of paternal concern vanishing in an instant. "You'll come back with me now and confess your lies." The only lies here, Aurelia said, walking to stand beside Yande, are the ones you tell yourself each night just to sleep. Judge Braddock, still staggering from the fall, pointed an accusatory finger. Look how the devil has corrupted her. Living in sin with a savage, defending him against men of God. Aurelia turned to look at Yande, the man who had offered her kindness when the world gave her only cruelty, who taught her how to survive, who showed her she could be loved without being owned. Then she looked at the men who had come to take her, the father who raped her, the judge who condemned without hearing, the soldiers ready to kill to drag her back to a life of shame and silence. The choice had never been clearer. You speak of sin, she said, her voice rising with each word. But where was God when I begged for protection? Where were you when I cried for help? This so-called savage gave me water when I was dying of thirst. He gave me shelter when I had nowhere to sleep. He treated me with dignity when you cast me out like garbage. Aurelia, Harrow started, but she cut him off. No, she shouted, her voice echoing through the canyon like a lioness protecting her cub. I'm not your prisoner anymore. I choose to stay here with him, far away from all of you. Silence fell. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, listening to the words that changed everything. The confrontation froze like ice forming across a still pond. Reverend Harrow's face went pale, the veins in his neck bulging like drawn cords. Braddock muttered prayers that sounded more like curses. The soldiers looked between each other, their eyes uncertain as if they no longer knew who the enemy was. You've lost your mind, Harrow hissed, his voice shaking with hatred and disbelief. This animal has bewitched you. You can't be thinking clearly. Aurelia felt Yande shift slightly behind her, a protective gesture that filled her with strength. For the first time in her life, someone truly stood with her. My mind has never been clearer, she replied, surprised by the steel in her voice. For the first time in years I can think without fear, without shame, without that constant voice telling me I'm never enough. Blasphemy, Braddock spat, struggling to stay upright with the help of his cane. This creature has completely corrupted you. We can see it in the rotten fruit their profane union has already borne. He pointed at her belly with such revulsion, it turned her stomach. But before she could answer, Yande stepped forward, placing himself partially between her and their accusers. The child she carries, he said, his voice calm, steady, an anchor in the chaos, is not the fruit of our union. It is the result of a violence these holy men pretend not to see. The words dropped like stones into still water, sending ripples through the air. Even the soldiers shifted, discomfort spreading across their faces. Lies, Harrow shouted, but his voice cracked with something else now, desperation. She's a lost woman making up stories to destroy a man of God. Then why chase her? Yande asked, his voice like a blade wrapped in velvet. If she's just a liar, why ride across the desert with armed men? Why not let her die out here like any sinner deserves? The question lingered in the air, heavy as judgment. Aurelia saw something shift in the soldier's eyes. Doubt, real doubt. For the first time they were truly listening. Because, Harrow faltered, searching for words that would still hold weight. Because it's my Christian duty to save even the lost. Your duty, Aurelia said, her voice cutting clean and cold, ended the day you decided I was your possession instead of your daughter. She stepped forward then, shedding every trace of modesty or submission. The morning sun caught her face, illuminating not the broken girl who had fled the village, but a woman transformed, stronger, fiercer, alive. You want the truth? She asked, her voice steady as steel. For months after Benedita died and I was left alone in that house, this man who calls himself my father would come into my room in the middle of the night. He held me down when I fought, threatened me when I tried to scream. Her voice didn't waver. Each word struck like hammer against iron. When I found out I was pregnant, I told my mother. She called me a liar and said I was trying to destroy the family. I went to the town doctor. He told me hysterical women always imagine things. Braddock tried to interrupt, but Aurelia didn't stop. And when I couldn't hide the pregnancy anymore, when the whole town found out, I was thrown out like a diseased animal. He kept giving sermons. He kept being respected. He kept being called a holy man. Silence gripped the canyon. Even the desert itself seemed to hold its breath. This man, she said, pointing to Yande, found me half dead, starved and dehydrated. He gave me water without asking for anything, built a shelter for me, taught me to survive. And in all these months, not once has he touched me without permission. Not once has he made me feel anything less than human. Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't tears of weakness. They were tears of freedom. each word spoken, breaking another chain, another cell. "So you tell me," she said, locking eyes with Reverend Harrow, "who here is really the savage?" One of the younger soldiers slowly lowered his rifle, then another. Doubt spread among them like wildfire through dry brush. They had come to apprehend a sinner, but now it seemed they might be standing on the wrong side of justice. Reverend Harrow realized he was losing control, his face twisted into a mask of impotent rage. "It doesn't matter," he shouted. "It doesn't matter what happened. You will come back. You are my daughter and you will obey." "No," Aurelia said with quiet certainty. "I'm not your daughter. I renounce any bond we ever had, and I'm not going anywhere with you." What happened next took everyone by surprise. Lieutenant Morrow, the eldest among the soldiers, stepped forward and slowly drove his sword into the earth. "I can't do this," he said, voice heavy with shame. "I won't drag a pregnant woman back to that." One by one, the other soldiers followed. They lowered their weapons, stepped back, until only Reverend Harrow and Judge Braddock stood, remnants of a justice that had just been weighed and found false. The transformation was complete. Aurelia had faced her past and won, not through violence, not through revenge, but through truth spoken with unwavering courage. And there, in the desert where she had nearly died of despair, she had finally come alive. Reverend Harrow's defeat was total and public, watching his own men turn against him. Realizing his authority had evaporated like desert rain, he made one last desperate play. "Fine," he spat, froth forming at the corners of his mouth. "Stay with your savage, but don't think you've escaped the consequences. If you ever return to a Christian town, they'll all know what kind of woman you are." "I know exactly what kind of woman I am," Aurelia replied, with a serenity that surprised even herself. "I am a free woman." The words hit Harrow like a slap. He mounted his horse with jerky, angry movements, his face twisted with helpless fury. "You'll regret this," he screamed as he rode off. "When hunger comes, when disease strikes, when you realize you've chosen a life of misery, you'll beg to come back." But Aurelia said nothing. She simply watched as he and Braddock disappeared into the distance, followed by the few soldiers still loyal to them. Lieutenant Morrow and the others lingered for a moment, as if they wanted to apologize, then turned and walked silently in another direction. When the last echo of hoofbeats faded, Aurelia's knees gave way. Yande caught her before she could fall, his strong arms wrapping around her in an embrace of pure relief and gratitude. "It's over," he whispered in her ear. "It's truly over." But even as he said it, they both knew that wasn't quite true. What had ended was only the first act. What began now was more dangerous, building a life together in a world that didn't approve of their union. In the weeks that followed, Aurelia's transformation accelerated. It was as if the confrontation with her past had broken the last barrier keeping her from becoming who she was meant to be. She blossomed in ways she hadn't known were possible. Her survival skills, patiently taught by Yande, sharpened until she could identify healing herbs by scent, predict weather shifts by watching birds, and locate water through signs only her trained eye could now detect. But it was through her sewing that the most unexpected change occurred. Using fibers from desert plants and natural dyes, Yande taught her to extract from roots and blossoms. She began crafting garments unlike anything she'd ever made before. They were practical, yet beautiful, pieces that blended the European techniques she had learned in town with the indigenous patterns and methods Yande had shared. "You have the hands of an artist," he told her one afternoon, watching her work on a shawl that seemed to capture the desert's colors at sunset. "These clothes, they tell stories." Aurelia looked at her work with new eyes. He was right. Each piece carried something of her journey, her rebirth. These were clothes for a woman who belonged neither entirely to the world of settlers nor to the native lands, but had created her own space between the two. "Maybe this is what I was always meant to do," she said. "To make something new instead of trying to fit into old molds." As the days passed, her belly grew rounder, and so did the bond between her and Yande. It wasn't physical. Both knew it was too soon, that she needed time to heal, but emotional, deeper with every shared conversation, every quiet moment, every small gesture of care. One night, as they prepared the evening fire, Aurelia asked the question that had lingered in her mind for weeks. "What will happen when the baby comes?" Yande stopped stirring the flames and looked at her with a steady seriousness. "What do you want to happen?" "I want him, or her, to grow up knowing they're loved. I want them to have a real family, not like the one I had. And do you want me to be part of that family?" The question hung between them, thick with meaning and uncertainty. Aurelia's heart beat faster, Not from fear, but hope. Yes, she said simply. If you want to. Yande moved closer until he could take her hand. From the day I found you in the desert, you and the baby became my responsibility, not out of duty, but because I chose you. I love you, both of you. They were the first words of love between them, and they landed softly in the night like seeds on fertile earth. Aurelia felt tears rising again, but this time they were made of joy. I love you too, she whispered. I didn't think I could love again after everything, but you showed me my heart wasn't broken, just wounded. They kissed for the first time that night, a gentle, reverent kiss that sealed a commitment deeper than any ceremony. Beneath the stars, two wounded souls promised themselves to each other and to the child soon to arrive, to build something new, something beautiful, a family forged not from blood or obligation, but from love freely chosen. The next morning, they began building a true home, not a shelter to pass the night, but a house, a future, a place where their child could grow, a place far from judgment and full of love. Aurelia's transformation was nearly complete. The timid, broken woman who had fled the village no longer existed. In her place stood someone strong, capable, loved, and free. For the first time in her life, she knew exactly who she was and where she belonged. The first cry echoed across the cave at dawn one October morning, as the first rains in months began to soften the parched earth. Aurelia awoke with sensations she instinctively recognized. Her time had come. Yande guided her through the long hours of labor, with a serenity that left her unsure whether she admired it or envied it. His calloused hands became instruments of infinite tenderness, applying cool compresses to her brow, massaging her aching back, whispering encouragement in his native tongue, a language she did not understand, but whose meaning soaked into her heart. It's almost time, he said, as her cries resonated against the stone walls. I can see the head. Then, between a contraction and the next, between pain and relief, a small life emerged that would change everything. Not the boy she had imagined for months, but a baby girl, tiny, perfect, with golden skin merging multiple heritages and eyes that opened to meet theirs with ancient knowing. Caetana, Aurelia whispered, remembering the name they had chosen for their daughter. Our little Caetana. Yande caught their baby with reverence as though holding a miracle, and perhaps she was. Here was living proof that beauty could spring from pain, love could grow where it seemed impossible. She is our healing, he said, echoing words he had softly spoken months ago when they were still two wounded souls striving to survive together. Caetana's earliest years were marked by a joy Aurelia had never imagined possible. The girl grew strong and healthy, a child of the desert who learned to walk on hot sand before she felt grass beneath her feet. Her first words were a lyrical blend of Portuguese and Tupi. Yande was a devoted father, teaching his daughter the legends of his people, showing her how to read the signs of nature, how to find water in vanishing landscapes. Aurelia shared her own skills, sewing, cooking, crafting beauty with her hands. But perhaps the most crucial lesson they taught together was that family is not defined by blood or tradition, but by love and intentional choice. That belonging means building a place with your own heart and hands. Their small community grew slowly. Other exiles occasionally found their way to the hidden valley where they had built their home, displaced indigenous people, women fleeing forced marriages, men persecuted for debts or crimes they didn't commit. Aurelia and Yande welcomed them with the same hospitality that had once saved their lives. We are a new people, Aurelia said one evening, watching Caetana play with children who had arrived with their refugee families. We are neither settlers nor natives. We are something different. We are free, Yande replied, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. And that's all that matters. But freedom always comes at a cost, and theirs was demanded when Caetana turned 3. The news came from a lone trader passing through their valley to trade goods. Reverend Harrow had died, not of disease or old age, but of shame. Rumors of what he had done to his daughter spread in time, whispered first in confessionals, then in marketplaces, until the region learned the truth. They say he drank himself into oblivion every night, the trader said, chewing on jerky Aurelia had prepared, and that he'd wake screaming your name, begging forgiveness from empty walls. Aurelia felt a tangle of emotions, relief and sorrow, and a bitter justice that brought little peace. Yande saw her turmoil, and that night as Caetana slept in her carved wooden cot, they spoke about forgiveness. You don't have to forgive him, Yande said. Some wounds run too deep to ever fully heal. But I don't have to carry hatred forever, Aurelia answered. He already stole enough years from me. I refuse to let him steal another day of my happiness. It was wisdom dearly won, and marked the final stage of her transformation. She had freed herself, not only physically from her past, but emotionally as well. Their small community continued to grow. Aurelia became a midwife and healer, using the knowledge she had learned from Yande to help other women. The garments she wove, with unique patterns blending diverse traditions, became sought after by traders who carried her creations to faraway villages. "You're becoming famous," Yande remarked, as she worked on an especially intricate cloak. "Soon people will journey here just to buy your clothes." "Let them come," Aurelia replied with a smile. "The more people know about this place, the harder it will be for anyone to drive us out." It was a wise strategy. By becoming known for their talents instead of their scandalous origins, they were reshaping their narrative. No longer was she the dishonored woman, and he the savage. They were the valley's artisans, the desert's healers, people who formed beauty where others saw only desolation. By Caetana's 5th birthday, she spoke 3 languages fluently and knew more about healing plants than many professional herbalists. She was a brilliant and curious child, combining Yande's ancient wisdom with Aurelia's creative spirit. "She will be extraordinary," Aurelia said, watching her daughter teach a younger child to fashion cords from desert fibers. "She'll change the world." "She already changed ours," Yande replied, and he was right. Caetana's arrival completed a transformation, begun years ago in the desert, not just for Aurelia, who had gone from victim to survivor to matriarch of her own family, but for everyone around her. They created something new, a community founded on acceptance, chosen love, and the revolutionary belief that people can define their own lives regardless of where they came from or what had happened to them. 5 years had passed since that terrible and beautiful day when Aurelia had confronted her father in the desert. 5 years that felt like a lifetime, or perhaps the awakening of a life that had been asleep far too long. The valley had transformed as completely as its inhabitants. What began as a desperate refuge for 2 exiles had grown into a thriving community of nearly 30 souls. Adobe and stone houses dotted the landscape, carefully irrigated gardens yielded vegetables and herbs, and a chorus of voices in multiple languages echoed through the rocky walls, a vivid testament to diversity. Aurelia watched it all from the porch of their home, not the rough cave of the early days, but a strong, beautiful structure she and Yande had built with their own hands. Caetana laughed and played with other children in the yard, her laughter mingling with the gentle murmur of the fountain Yande had crafted at the center of their community. "What are you thinking about?" Yande asked, as he came up behind her, wrapping her in his strong arms. "How far we've come," she replied, leaning into his broad chest. "Sometimes it still feels impossible." "Me too," he admitted, kissing the top of her head. "When I found you that first day, I thought I was saving a life. I didn't know you would save mine too." It was true. Yande had changed just as profoundly as she had. The lonely, bitter man who had lost everything had become a respected leader, a loving father, a devoted husband. His hands, once only instruments of survival, now shaped beauty, wood carvings, irrigation systems, toys for the valley's children. "Mom! Dad! Come see!" Caetana shouted, running toward them, her small hands cupping something bright. "I found a stone that looks like a heart." It was a small piece of rose quartz smoothed by time and water until it shimmered like a jewel. Aurelia took it with wonder as the sun made it sparkle. "It's beautiful, my love. Where did you find it?" "Near the fountain there were others, but this one was the prettiest." Caetana grinned, revealing a missing front tooth from just last week. "Can I keep it and make a necklace?" "Of course you can," Yande said, kneeling to meet their daughter's level. "But first, how about you help us make dinner? Mrs. Elena promised to teach you her cornbread recipe." Caetana clapped excitedly. Eleanor was one of the newest refugees, an elderly woman who'd fled her village after her son was falsely accused of theft. Her cooking skills quickly made her beloved by the community. As Aurelia watched their daughter dash back to join the others, a wave of gratitude nearly overwhelmed her. This life, this family, this community, this sense of belonging had grown from the deepest pain she'd ever known, but it had been worth every tear, every moment of despair, every uncertain second. "Yande," she said suddenly, "I want to do something." "What is it?" "I want our story to be told, not the version my father or Judge Braddock would tell, the true one. I want other women to know they can escape, that they can begin again. He looked at her with that intensity she had learned to recognize, the way he looked when she surprised him with her strength or wisdom. "How?" "I'm going to write it," she said, the idea forming as she spoke. "Benedita taught me to read and write when I was little. I'll document our story, the stories of everyone who found sanctuary here. I'll create proof that this place exists, that this way of living is possible." And that's exactly what she did. In the weeks that followed, Aurelia began to write, first her own story. The pain, the humiliation, the escape, the meeting with Yande, the slow, sometimes painful transformation that led her here. Then she recorded the stories of the others. Every refugee, every exile, every wounded soul who found healing in their valley. If this story of rebirth moved your heart, don't forget to like this video and comment with your favorite part. And subscribe for more inspiring tales, proving that love and courage can conquer any hardship. Till the next story. The work became a sacred obsession. Aurelia wrote by candlelight after Caetana slept, documenting not just events but emotions, transformations, daily miracles that proved redemption was possible. When she finished, she held something precious, a testament that people deemed lost by society could not only survive but thrive, that love could spring in the most impossible places, that families could be built by conscious choice, not blood alone. "It's a manifesto," Yande said, reading the first chapters. "A manifesto for the rejected, the exiled, the forgotten." "It's a promise," Aurelia corrected, "a promise that hope always exists, even when everything feels lost." On the final page, exactly 5 years after her flight from Saint Aria, Aurelia sat on her porch watching the sunset stain the desert in gold and crimson. Caetana slept soundly in her lap, tired from a day of play, and Yande whittled a new wooden sculpture depicting a man, woman, and child holding hands beneath a starlit sky. The night breeze carried the scent of flowers that bloomed only in darkness, and Aurelia breathed deeply, filling her lungs with the air of freedom. She thought of the woman she had been, haunted, broken, convinced she didn't deserve love or happiness. She seemed like a stranger now, a shadow from long-ago dreams. In her place stood someone real, mother, wife, leader, artist, survivor, and most important, someone who knew without a doubt that she belonged exactly where she was. The desert that once felt like exile had become a place of rebirth. And there, beneath the eternal stars Yande had taught her to read as a map home, Aurelia smiled. Her transformation was complete. Redemption had been won. The future for her, for Yande, for Caetana, for all who found sanctuary in their valley, stretched out before them like a promised land they had created themselves. In the end, she realized, it wasn't about fleeing the desert. It was about learning how to make the desert bloom.